I ask people, and then yeah, you can feel free, I guess, to ask questions too, and we can take this any way, which way direction that you want. I love talking about fire. I worked in fire forever, and now I get to kind of combine experiences and everything to do cool things. So
Okay. Is it Dominique? What's your
yep,
preferred?
most people call me Domo.
Okay. Let me do a little intro here to get it on the recording. So I'd have to do less work to do this as a bonus episode. So,
Copy that.
hey guys, Red Hills Rancher here with a special bonus episode. And I'm sitting down with a lady that contacted me on Instagram and reached out and wanted to talk to me about some of my experiences about wildfire. So I'm kind of excited for this conversation. So, uh, Ms. Domo Woodham, would you please introduce yourself?
Yeah, so I'm Domo Woodham. I work for Montana State University Extension, and I'm a natural resources extension agent with a specialty in wildfire education. And so most of what I'm doing is talking with people about how they can prepare for, respond to, and recover from wildfire.
Awesome. Awesome. So you had some questions for me, and I guess I can roll right into those because you're
Sure.
supposed to be interviewing me. Um,
Yes. And so, maybe you want me to share a little bit of background about the project, about how it all came to be, and we'll go from there.
yeah, that'd
So
be great.
awesome. So my position in extension was pretty unique because it was 100% grant funded, and so I had grants that funded me when I first came into the job, and then I looked for others and kind of have used creativity and experiences to kind of branch out what I do. So back in 2018, I was working with some partners of mine from the Northern Plains Climate Hub, and we kind of did a grant proposal pitch competition, more or less. And I pitched this idea that I wanted to do an agricultural producer discussion panel where people would share their wildfire lessons learned so that other people could learn from their experiences. And that proposal got selected for a small bit of funding. And so what we did was at the 2018 Wyoming Stock Growers Winter Roundup, we hosted this discussion panel, and we had um, two ranchers that were on the panel, as well as NRCS specialists and USDA Forest Service specialists that had worked with these two particular producers during their wildfire experience. And initially, we had, I think, an hour of time blocked out for the discussion, and I had about 25 questions that I had prepared that I was going to ask people. And the audience took over. People loved it. Our discussion panel went on for 2 hours, and I only made it through maybe three of my questions before folks from the audience were raising their hands and, either asking specific questions to individual people or posing them to the group. And a couple things were realized while doing that was people loved that. People love learning from their peers. They love learning from experiences, that tangible stuff that you can apply to your own life. People absolutely love that. And it's way more, I guess, receptive to people rather than, maybe having a specialist or someone maybe from a university saying, like, you should do this and this based on this research. People want to see the direct on the ground experience and what happened. And that's so invaluable. And so, as a result of the discussion panel, we made a couple of really nice posters that had select quotes from each of those people. And, we distributed those and they were really cool. But that kind of always stuck with me was how can we go bigger with this? How can we reach more people? Because the other thing I've learned over the years is I worked in fire management for 12 and a half years before extension. And every time there's a wildfire, there's a couple things that happen. Folks will act like it's the first time there's ever been a wildfire that's impacted them, and that's not the case. Typically, this happens over and over all over the country. And so because
we,
it happens over and over all over the country,
we tend to
people in
have
other
short
areas.
memories as human beings for things
Oh,
like that.
yes. And so, and that was the thing was, how can I bring everyone's stories and experiences together? So, um, last year I got a small grant, or I guess it was a sub contract from the Montana DNRC, to do wildfire lessons learned for agriculture and rural communities. And with that project, I've both been traveling around Montana mainly, doing interviews via email, phone call, podcast, and talking to people and learning what's their wildfire story. And it could have been anything. It could have been how they prepared for wildfire, how they responded, how they recovered or didn't recover, and then what did they learn, and if they could do it over, or if they could share any juicy nuggets of advice with people, what would it be? And that has been a blast. I've talked with folks in Montana, Wyoming, Washington, Colorado, and now Kansas. And so wildfire is something that's near and dear to me, as is agriculture. And so I'm really happy to be able to bring everything together.
That's great. Thank you for sharing that. That gives me a lot more context, and it also gave me a little bit of time to make some notes here. Um, so I'm Brandon Alexander. A lot of folks will know me as Red Hills Rancher on social media. I'd be Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, and TikTok, where I'm most active. Where I live, I'm in South Central Kansas in the Red Hills. Um, my management context is we get about 24 inches of rain, 22 to 24 inches of rain in a normal average year, and normal is just a setting on a dryer, and we never get that. And it's never evenly distributed between growing season and dormant season, and there's a lot of variability in our humidity as well. We can have cool humid summers, we can have warm dry summers, we can have warm humid summers, we can have cool, we can have almost any variation of weather here. So it does make for a challenge to manage in. um so my occupation is I'm a full-time rancher. I am a ecological engineer, or a grazing engineer. I fix land problems with livestock, or at least that's how I've been trying to brand myself for years. um I've been through ranching for profit several times, and I've also been through holistic management. I briefly considered being a holistic management certified educator, but I think I'm being called and pulled in a different direction. So throughout my life, and I had an early exposure to a lot of these holistic concepts and ranching for profit principles. Whoop, wrong button. So the history of the ranch is it like I said, it's 7,000 acres of native grassland, and there was about 500 acres of it that was farmed at one point and broken out. Um, that's all been back to grass for 30 plus years. So the land that I currently am privileged enough to be the steward of was originally started to be put together by my family as early as I can tell, around 1906, when some of my first ancestors came to this area. And I can't really find out much about those early days, but I know in the 30s there were sheep on the ranch, and possibly even up to the 50s. And then in the late 40s, great great grandfather discovered oil, and he kind of decided he was going to go be an oil man and didn't really care much about the ranch. And from about the mid 50s until 1984, when my dad got control over it, the ranch was leased out and operated by others. Um, it wasn't well managed. So when dad took it over in 84, he described it as, um, he's going to yell at me one of these days because I don't always have this quote just exactly right, but it was an overgrazed, underutilized cedar forest without any water. And he spent his life learning how to manage the grass, and and even though the term really didn't exist at the time, begin the process of regeneration and restoring the native habitat of the ranch. That's what he chose to do when he got control of the ranch. Is he chose to spend any capital or startup money he had on improving the resource that he had, rather than going out and buying cows, which is what a typical response would be. And because he didn't know anything about cows, but he knew he could do something with the land that he had and learn how to make money without needing to own cows. And that's what ranching for profit taught him. So my experience with fire
I
is
will jump in here, and I want to say I heard you speak at the Grass Fed Exchange 2 years ago, and that's why I wanted to reach out to you, because I remembered you talking and sharing about this wildfire, and that was one of those things like, you know, this is a great story to be able to share with a bigger audience rather than who's sitting in this room right now here in Sonoma. So I am so excited we get to hear this again.
and even 2 years down the line, I've been able to make some more observations, and hopefully we have time to get into that, and I can share that with you later. So my experience with fire, I'm 42 now. When I was 8, my dad handed me a drip torch and said, "Walk that way." So we've got a long history of being borderline pyromaniacs out here in the Red Hills. So I have a very long history with prescribed fire. I also spent a little over 8 years in the Navy. And while I was in the Navy, I was an engineer. And if you know anything about the Navy at all and shipboard life, if you're an engineer, you are also a firefighter, guaranteed. It doesn't matter what you want to do as an engineer. You are a firefighter, and if you're on the ship, you're going to have to learn firefighting somehow. So I worked my way up, and I qualified some fairly high levels of damage control, and eventually I was a part of the damage control training team, teaching teaching techniques and how to fight fires and control damage on a ship. So I brought a lot of that management experience back with me when I returned home in 2006, and I've kind of stepped into a leadership role with our prescribed burn association on our local burn group. There's several people that approach me for advice and planning about how to execute their burn, and there's several people that kind of depend on me to be their burn boss on their property. So
So let
it's
me ask you something. Going back, so I had similar experience where I grew up in Alaska. My family had hay fields that we would burn every single spring. My grandpa and my uncle and myself, and we didn't use drip torches. We just did it old school with lighter and rakes and running around. And I guess this is something I think back on because that was my introduction to fire and prescribed burning in particular. With you, running around with a drip torch at 8, when your dad would line you out, did he tell you why you guys were burning everything? Or was it kind of like, this is just something we do?
well, back in the early days, it was, I always understood that it was a way to get rid of the cedar trees. I understood from a really early age that the eastern red cedar tree was a bad thing on the grasslands, and we can get into that later. I've got a ton of research and things we can talk about to show um, grassland biome conversion to closed canopy juniper forest, and the researchers that are behind this project at University of Nebraska Lincoln are like they're within a hair's breadth of figuring out the economic impact of eastern red cedar tree encroachment on the Great Plains due to loss of forage production. So that's really cool. We can jump into that later. I rabbit trailed off. So what was your question? What did you want me to get into?
Like when you were young and you were
Oh, okay.
teaching
The
your fire
context of
first.
fire, right?
Yeah.
So I understood from a pretty early age that we had to burn to control the cedar trees. Now, man, I tell you what, if you've never seen a big stack of eastern red cedar or other juniper go up in a giant ball of fire that's just a column of black smoke 10,000 feet high. I mean, literally 10,000 feet high. And you can feel the heat a quarter of a mile away. and you planned that, you briefed the team, and your guys did that according to your plan, and you just get to sit back and watch this massive, beautiful act of regeneration and rejuvenation take place on the plains. Like that is a great feeling. But we're not here to talk about prescribed fire. You know, you're talking about burning hayfields in Alaska every year, and there's a lot to be said about contextually appropriate management, and burning can be one of those tools in the manager's toolbox. But the point I was kind of making is, like, when a lot of people think about fire and prescribed fire, a lot of people are familiar with it on a very small scale, like, burning a CRP field or burning a hay field that may have a road around it on all four sides. And it's, only 50 acres, and, you can pick kind of a nice calm evening and be done in 2 hours. We don't have that luxury out here on the plains. We need to burn. Last year, as a burn association in our area, we burned about, I think, a little over 10,000 acres. I forgot to have that number handy. Um, and most of those were spring burns, which would be late dormant season. We did a few summer burns, and we can talk about timing of that later. But that's prescribed burning. We're not talking about that. uh, so we figured that we need to be burning almost 100,000 acres within our association's umbrella area, so to speak, the area that we cover. We need to be doing 10 times the burning that we are. And we're one of the most active groups in the state. We are the oldest burn association in the state. Like, we founded the 501c3. I was a founding member of that. And then our local group grew, and we turned that over, and that became the State Prescribed Burn Association. That has spawned, I can't even tell you how many daughter chapters throughout the state. So fire culture and acceptance of fire culture, and knowing how to be a successful practitioner of prescribed fire, and knowing when it's contextually appropriate to pull that tool out of your toolbox, is wildfire prevention. Which, wildfire is really what we want to talk about today, right?
I love talking about everything fire, but yeah, we'll get back on track.
Okay, so the wildfire experience that I'd really like to share would be the Anderson Creek wildfire in 2016. So it's coming up. The 5-year anniversary of that is coming up on 2 weeks. And in fact, four years ago, right now, I was in Las Vegas, and there was another fire burning within 40 miles of here called the Starbuck Fire that was much bigger than Anderson Creek. I think Starbuck ended up being around 640,000 acres, but it's classified as a complex fire. Anderson Creek wildfire was a point source wildfire, and it burned, I think the official revised number is somewhere around 343,000. Okay. So the conditions leading up to that up to Anderson Creek in 2016 is, there's some cattle market factors that are kind of involved that, shorten up cattle numbers and took grass out of production, took some cattle off of grass. That was also kind of a wetter period in this area during the growing season. So we grew a tremendous amount of grass.
Mhm.
And not everybody, myself included, was effective at utilizing the grass they grew. So there was a lot of grass left over that just stayed around. And the winter of 2016 was exceptionally dry, and it was fairly warm. I was working on a tree clearing project all winter, and I was within probably 3 or 4 days of being done, wrapping it up, putting a bow on it, and hauling my gear out back to the yard when Anderson Creek wildfire hit. So when that hit, I had a lot of money wrapped up in my tree clearing operation, sitting out in the pasture, and a fire went right through it, and like 2 tires on my trailer and 1 tire on an attachment. That was it. Like the rest of my machinery was fine. So anyway, back to conditions leading up to that. So the winter of 2016 was exceptionally dry, and it was fairly warm. So we we had a lot of forage, we had a lot of fuel load, had a lot of what those in the know call a fine fuel. We had a lot of fine fuel loading that was dry going into the end of March. Normally, um, our green up is about here, is typically 15 March is is when we have enough cool season grass that it will actually start to kind of impede fire progress a little bit. Generally, that's when the spring humidity starts coming in, and you know because as we all know, humidity is a huge factor in fire. As long as your humidity is above 20%, your risk of wildfire is fairly small unless your temperature is over 80 degrees, but we can get into those curves later. Um, so it was almost the perfect storm. And looking back, I can see this weather pattern repeated so many times in the late winter. It's the polar vortex wind pattern. We're having it literally right now. We've got several days of really strong, hot, dry south winds. Then a front will come through, and that will drive a rapid switch from the south to the northwest. And the really bad fires that we've had in this area, and there were bad fires in 2018 and in 2019. I don't have their names and figures off the top of my head. I remember where they were, but I've been studying the weather pattern, and it's the same thing. We'll get that red flag warning day 2 or 3 days in advance. The National Weather Service has become fantastic about being able to get these red flag warnings out many days in advance. In the last 5 years, they've just come so far in being able to get the warning out, when there's a red flag warning day. So it wasn't quite that quick in 2016. Now I think they almost give us an extra day, almost 36 hours, some more warning than they did 5 years ago. So it's kind of improved that much. And that does help, with a fire management context. So, we had that really strong 25-mile-an-hour south wind that was hot and dry. And then we had the cold front come through that had no moisture behind it, and that it didn't drop the temperature very much, about 15 degrees. But what it did is it made the wind switch from the south at 20 to the northwest at 40 to 45. And it doesn't matter how badass of a firefighter you think you might be, you are not going to chase down and actively attack a grass fire burning in 4 to 6,000 pounds of dry fine fuel that's being pushed by 40 to 45 miles an hour wind. Sorry, buddy, you ain't doing it. So the fire started way down in Oklahoma, and it was Tuesday afternoon. And I remember, I have such kind of a clear memory of that almost few days. Um, I remember it. I remember it starting. I kind of remember that day, the things leading up to that day, and knowing that the weather was going to be bad. And that Tuesday morning, Vanderson Creek, I had a feeling of dread. Just the wind and the humidity and the heat, and I just had a feeling. I just had a feeling. And my ranch is fairly high, like in elevation. Okay, yeah, we're talking about Kansas. It's flat compared to what most people are used to, but I do have 30% incline on my hills that are 200 feet high. So I've got stuff that's just as steep as a lot of stuff out in Colorado in the mountains. It's just not as big, and we live on top of it. We don't live down in the valleys because the valleys are too small. So my ranch is kind of up on top, and I can see long ways to the west. I can see a long ways to the south, a long ways to the north, and a long ways to the east. And I've trained myself over the years on days like that. You keep an eye upwind. And all of us, there's several of us out here that, on days like that, we kind of, we don't go hide in the house like we normally would. We get out, we stay with our radios, we keep our phones charged, and you keep your eyes upwind, and you keep your nose working and make sure you're not smelling anything weird. Because in 40 miles an hour wind, you don't see a smoke column. You might not see the smoke column until you are short minutes away from having that head fire on top of you.
Hmm.
So,
Hang on, let me jump in here with a quick
okay.
question. So, this is one of the things I've been asking people from out of state. So here in Montana, you can kind of divide Montana as far as Western Montana, Eastern Montana. Everything east of the divide is pretty much Eastern Montana for all intents and purposes. We got open prairie, badlands, breaklands, everything, island mountain ranges, you name it. Um, Also in Eastern Montana, it's fairly common where on farms and ranches, people either A, have their own private firefighting equipment, either on ATV, UTV, on the trucks. Also, there is like a co-op program with Montana DNRC where they kind of have fire engines that they'll strategically place in rural counties because there isn't a paid fire response. So, how about for context, like what you guys have in Kansas?
Okay, unified response and command in 2016 was non-existent. And that was my sole biggest critique. Like that's my biggest that was my biggest issue with how that fire was managed. Was there was no overall command and control. There was very little coordination between units. Um, Getting enough help fast enough was a problem. And I'll admit they didn't learn all the lessons they needed to before Starbuck happened like less than a year later. I mean, after Anderson Creek, a lot of people were thinking, oh, wow, I hope that never happens again. I hope that never happens again. That was a once in a 100-year thing. That was a once in a 100-year thing. And myself and a few others are going, no, guys, no, no. That just means we're out of the woods for a little while. Look around.
Mhm.
This will happen again. It might be 5 years, it might be 10 years, but we will see another mega fire like this. There were a lot of doubters that said it wouldn't happen again. I was one of the few that said that it was going to. I had no idea it would be less than a year that we would almost double, the size of the Anderson Creek fire. Um, so I want to take this opportunity, since I did say that the overall command and coordination was a little bit lacking in 2016, and I don't want that to be any disrespect at all to Barber County Fire Department, because at the time I was really, really critical of them. But now looking back, they did some things that they'd never done before. They used drip torches off a highway at about midnight, 1 o'clock in the morning, and they lit a backfire and they stopped the head fire at the highway, and they held it for 8.5 hours. And that 8.5 hours probably saved, it probably cut the fire down. It could have cut the fire from over 700,000 to what it was, because I know what's on the other side of where they stopped it. And I know where it would have gone to by the next morning when the wind started to switch. I mean, at 8 a.m. So, Barber County Fire, Rick Wesley, you deserve a shout out. Like, that's it. You did a good job that day. You and your boys did a good thing with that backfire. So they deserve that shout out. Um, so where was I? I was with my buddy Ed, and we were both trying to keep each other calm. We were setting up on a hill. We spent some time driving around before the sun went down. down south scouting around just after it crossed the state line. As I had fire radios with me. I guess let me back up a little bit more. So I'd said all day that Tuesday I'd kind of had a sense of dread.
Mhm.
And I went home at 5. I left the ranch at 5. And at 5, there wasn't I didn't see any smoke. I mean, yeah, there was a little bit of haze in the sky. I didn't see a smoke column. I didn't smell anything. The fire radios had been quiet all day. And I thought, it's 5 o'clock. We're close to the break point. Okay. That break point in the day where you can almost feel it, where the humidity and temperature curve breaks over and starts to drop, and then your wildfire danger starts to drop dramatically. I knew the humidity wasn't going to come up that much, but it was going to come up enough to help, and the wind was going to come down, and the temperature was going to come down. So wildfire, so spreading index, I guess, is what risk of spread would be kind of maybe the more technical way. So that risk was starting to decrease, obviously, once you reach that turning point. So I checked out. When I was rolling through Sun City, which is a mile away from my house, I stopped and I talked to my friend Tim, who lived catty corner from the firehouse. And we stopped right there on the street in front of his house. Like, I don't think it's Main Street, but it's like the street that meets Main Street in the center of town. Like, I just stopped there and we had a 10-minute conversation about the day, the weather. Thank God we hadn't had a fire. I went
Mhm.
home. 15 minutes later, the pagers went off. They were called for mutual aid to Oklahoma. And I'm thinking, okay, Oklahoma's a long way off. They'll have some time to get it shut down. They'll chase it, chase around into some canyons and they can, maybe they'll get it shut down. If not, maybe they can find a defense on the state line. Well, when I got the phone call that it was within 4 miles of the state line and running hard, that's when that's when I jumped in the truck with my best buddy Ed, and we went south to check out the situation. And we got down there, and it had already blown over the highway, or it had already blown over the county or the state line. There's a road down there. They the local fire departments, all the rural fire departments, and everybody that was there are with mutual aid, with assistance from some local landowners, members of our burn association. Um, they almost pinched it off between a green crop field and a burn that had been conducted several days prior. They came within 100 yards of having it, and they lost it there. So when I knew that they had that lost, I said, Ed, let's go back up to Estill Road. I said, why? I said, because that's the next place that they have any chance of holding this thing. I said, that's the next road north. I said, and you know what? You know what's past that? And he goes, no, fucking highway. Excuse my language. So by the time we got to Estill Road, we were there for a while, and Comanche County, which is the county um, east of, or west of me, they were responding in full force. And Comanche County Fire, those guys are on top of their game. Clark County Fire, those guys are some of the best. And I mean, they were having fairly successful luck, trying to pinch the flanks and trying to pinch the flanks. Um, they didn't hold Estill Road at all. There was no hope of holding Estill Road, and I saw it. And when that happened, Barber County was still on their way up. They were trying to regroup, and they were still trying to get in back in front of it. And I heard Rick come on the radio, and I said, can we stop it at Estill Road? And I got back on the radio and I said, Rick, this is Brian. No, it's already past Estill Road. You better go to the highway and you better make a plan. And you better go right now. without delay, because if you don't, it'll be there. It's going to be there at midnight, and that was like an hour and 20 or 30 minutes. And like I said, I got to give him credit. He got there and he got his boys organized, and they got a drip torch, and they stopped that head fire for 8 hours. And that was the best thing they could have done. So you were asking about equipment, I think was what your question actually was. So, um, our rural fire equipment has gotten a lot better in the last 5 years. Obviously, there's more awareness of wildfire, and there's been, the federal government has blessed us with some of our money back to buy better fire equipment, which was kind of nice. So we do have some upgraded fire equipment. Um, Things have worked better at the state level. There's new cooperation agreements. I forget what it's called, um, but there are cooperation agreements now in place between local rural fire and Kansas Forest Service, and any large event since 2018 is when they implemented all those systems. Excuse me. The large fires we've had since 2018 have had a much better, much more coordinated response, um, much faster. They've also started pre-positioning units. In Oklahoma, it's so funny. Like, lines on a map are so funny. Like, Oklahoma does things so different, and for a long time, you know, like, Oklahoma couldn't officially come help us unless they were asked a certain way, but it never mattered. I mean, if they needed our help, if somebody calls you, go. It, red flag day, 40-mile-an-hour wind, there's a fire in the world, and your phone rings, you go. That's it. You go and do whatever you can to help the people that are there. I mean, even if it's just maybe scouting and going and watching a flank or watching a corner or going and watching a road crossing, telling people don't drive into smoke. Don't go be a looky-loo, though. I'm not, if you're just going to go look, stay home. Don't get in anybody's way. People have a job to do. They're focused. Stay out of their way.
Mhm.
Um, so back to equipment. Man, I remember some of the shady stuff that we all used to use back in the 80s. Oh, wow. And there's still some people that show up at a fire with some stuff I look at and I just go, you are a backup unit for a backup unit for a backup unit. I am not putting you on the front line. I'm sorry. Um, but we have, a lot of us have pretty decent equipment, and we're getting better every year. There's an equipment donation program that our burner association takes part in from Kansas Forest Service. So we've gotten two Stewart and Stevenson deuce and a half trucks. Like, they just provide the truck. They retain ownership over it. You have to buy insurance, put the tires on it, whatever, and maintain it. And you got to put all your plumbing and your tanks and whatnot and your radios in it. And the most important thing is radios. Like, that is the number one thing a prescribed fire association needs is radios. Radios, 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 lots and lots of good radios. And learn how to use them, and learn how to use them effectively as a team, as a group. Um, so
I
there's
love that you hit on that because it just hits back on the LCES, communications, that's the big thing, that that's one of the stories I have heard from a lot of people, that communications is the breakdown point a lot of times. Like, things could have gone so much differently if communications were better, and whether that's equipment, radio, whether that's actual personnel, agency stuff, what
there's
have
times where
you.
it's like just having two units 100 yards down the line can make or break a day.
Mhm.
Just one person being out of position, one member of your team not knowing the plan and not knowing fully what's going on and what to expect, that can ruin your whole day.
and I I imagine that probably during Anderson Creek, because I'd heard stories from other folks in eastern Montana that, because you do have so many different responses. You've got folks that have their own Type 6 engines that are responding. You've got co-ops, you've got counties, you got state, federal agencies sometimes coming in. Um, One of the things I'd heard about the breakdowns in communication was you'd have local resources addressing a flank or even the head somewhere, but because they didn't have the frequencies that everybody else did, nobody knew they were there. And so there'd be situations where, say, another entity on some other part would decide, this is where we can catch it on this road. Let's do a backburn. And lo and behold, you've got X number of engines and personnel in between the main fire front, the road, and where they're doing the backburn.
You got
Obviously.
20 rigs and 50 guys up trying to do a back burn.
Hmm.
And then you got another 20 rigs and 50 guys trying to anchor a flank that's useless if your backfire works.
Hmm. Hmm. And they
Yeah,
don't know.
and they don't know, command and control communication.
Hmm.
And, there's no easy answer, I don't think, but every, it, things have gotten so much better in that realm in the last 5 years. And, um, you know, there's a red flag warning not far from here today. Like, we're borderline. Tomorrow may be a red flag. They haven't decided yet. Like, we're right there. I mean, we're critical fire weather. So,
Hmm.
you know, it's not on silent. it's it's here. It's waiting, and it's getting close to that time. I mean, 2 o'clock is when that danger starts to rise rapidly. So, with the communication aspect of it, from a wildfire context, there's I think that there's a lot of, trained professional fire managers that look down on private landowner fire practitioners as being untrained and unskilled. I don't have a red card. I've never been through the 102, 103 training. I don't have any desire to go through any of that crap. I've been lighting things on fire in my environment for 35 years. Do I consider myself an expert in my environment? Yes. Within my little narrow realm of the Red Hills, I would consider myself a fire expert. Take me to California, I'll still know a lot, and I'll still be able to give some good advice. But that's not my context, right? So we have to keep in mind that, all things in context. And the point I was making was, you know, we need like federal and state fire managers, government fire managers need to do a better job of involving these local burn groups that are organized, that know how to communicate and work together. Okay. Burn managers, go find those groups, go find those people and help support them, organize them. We had offered our services as a burn group to the Kansas Forest Service as a mobile task force. That's a command unit, 2 attack trucks, and embedded tanker support. I mean, it's a minimum 4 unit, self-contained task force. We can show up. Only one person has to talk to KFS. And they say, you're assigned to Zone J. Do this task. We're on it. We can do that. That agreement hasn't been formalized yet, and they haven't utilized our services. But there were a couple days last year that we were sitting on rigs ready to go. We were waiting for a call. So there's cooperation, communication. That's I think that's what's key. So, lessons learned from the Anderson Creek wildfire. This is where the good part starts, right? Um, so, I watched that fire burn up my whole ranch. I stayed out with Ed all night till I think he dropped me off around 2 o'clock in the morning. And that was after the backfire was successful. and they'd stopped the width of the head fire. And all they had to do was keep tying flanks and keep tying flanks and anchor flanks. And it kind of started to dawn on me that night, like, wait a minute. In the next 12 hours, the wind is going to be out of the north, out of the west to northwest at 30 to 40 miles an hour. What's going to happen when that happens? Is it possible to put enough trucks in that rough country to tie down 25 plus miles of what would be the right flank, the east flank, before that wind switch and turns that whole east flank into a head fire? I knew that was going to happen. I knew there was no way that they were going to tie that whole flank down. There aren't enough resources that could get to the area fast enough to be able to tie that flank down before the wind would switch and turn it into a head fire. It was basically inevitable. The only thing they had any effect on was stopping the northern spread, and they did a great job of that. I mean, if they hadn't stopped it where they would have stopped it, Domo, it would have gone another 20 to 25 miles north before the wind switched. And then when the wind switched, they would have had that much more ground to cover there. And that area north, north of where they stopped it, there's more people that live up there. It's a little rougher. And it leads almost straight to the town of Medicine Lodge that's home to 2,000 people.
Hmm.
And there was a way in for the fire. Like, there was a way in for it to get there. It didn't, partially because Barber County Fire stopped it at Tuesday night, Wednesday morning at Highway 160. That's what saved Medicine Lodge, not anything else. So, talking about lessons learned, a lot of the lessons learned, communication. So, what were the lessons we learned ecologically on a large scale? Okay. So, I've got a long history with fire, and I've had some great successes in cleaning up invasive species with fire and cleaning up, small areas. There have been a lot of areas that, a lot of types of areas, like, really steep canyons that are just totally infested with trees that we've never been successful getting to burn under prescribed burn conditions. Well, when it's a red flag day and you got 40 miles an hour wind, watch out, buddy, because 95% of your woody mass is going to burn. And it did. And entire canyons were cleaned out, and it was just amazing. So leading up to this, we'd experienced a couple other wildfires, which I haven't even talked about. There was one in 2008, and there was one in 2014. The one in 2008 burned up the middle 50 to 55% of the ranch, just right up the middle. And that was awesome. And if it hadn't have been for that and learning how to rebuild fence after that, like, 2016 would have been really rough. But some of the things I saw after 2008, okay, it was kind of another one of those red flag fire days. It cleaned out a canyon. It cleaned out a couple canyons full of cedar trees. Well, funny thing happens when you do that out here on this ranch. You start finding a creek. And the longer you keep, what we've found since then is if you can go in with some kind of horsepower, because I can't run enough stock density of bison to be able to trample dead cedar trees. So I've got to replicate that impact with a masticator or a mulcher.
Sure.
So spent a lot of time with a skid steer mounted mulcher mulching trees. I spent 850 hours in a leased excavator with a mulcher head on it in 2 years. And that's all I did for 2 years was sit in that excavator and grind up trees.
Oh, wow.
So creating habitat, restoring native habitat. Okay. Now I'm not saying cedars aren't native. They're native to the Red Hills. History supports that. Anecdotal history supports that 100%. But they're infesting the grasslands because we have removed fire from the equation. And the rate of conversion, it's scary. And the amount of money that is being spent on preventative methods. My friend Direct Twidwell at University of Nebraska Lincoln, I'd be happy to hook you up with his contact information or make an introduction. He's working with something called the Rangeland Analysis Platform, RAP, and he is studying the effects of biome conversion, fire on the landscape, and ways to stop encroachment of woody plants into the grassland biome. And I hate to say this, it kind of sound like bragging. But he's Direct's been here several times. In fact, he was just here a couple weeks ago for our Burn Association's annual meeting, and he gave a great presentation about some of the updates to RAP and the new things that they've learned since he gave his first presentation to us a little over a year ago, which kind of just blew me away. So they're charting, they can see the effects between. Okay, let me back up. So what Rangeland Analysis Platform will show you, the data you can get from it, you can get a year by year progression. And some of the information's at different scales, but it's all at a relevant scale. Okay. Some of it's even, like maybe a 2 or 3 kilometer block, whatever, but it's still a relevant scale to show you long-term change on a large scale. Right. It's not going to give me a lot of useful information, tell me where I need to go exactly cut trees on my ranch.
Mhm.
Okay. But the data that it does drive, okay. So it's going to show you, it knows the difference between, woody herbaceous, sagebrush, a farm field, a corn crop, and native rangeland. And it has biomass estimates now for all of these categories. Okay. So now people got to, don't get hung up on biomass as your benchmark to be shooting for, tons of biomass per acre, because that's wrong. It's the carbon sequestration potential of that biomass per acre that we need to think about in that context. Okay. So what the data is showing is the eastern red cedar trees and junipers, Virginia, is basically converting the entire grasslands biome at a rapidly accelerating rate. It's almost a geometric progression, skateboard ramp that you wouldn't want to ride a bicycle down. But the important lesson that he's learning, okay, is they're showing that these two big that Anderson Creek wildfire is the example he likes to use when he comes down and talks to us and tells us that, we're his best example of, prescribed burn association, leveraging a wildfire to have a core, blah, 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 blah. I'm sure he says the same thing when he goes to Nebraska and he talks about the Lusk Canyon Rangeland Alliance, because they had a similar wildfire up there that burned out a lot of their members' ranches. And that was also a wake up call for them. Like, hey, we got this big area cleaned up now that we can defend. Okay. We have a core. And then we're also looking at several of these cores in the Red Hills. Now, let me explain what a core is. So part of a Direct's research, DIRAC, just so nobody's confused, Dirac. That's how he says his name. I didn't give it to him. He says, wow, that was a bad rabbit trail. I forgot what I was going to say. Well, I forgot how I was going to quote him. he's about ready to put a number like on the cost to the ecosystem to do nothing. So he talks about cores. Okay. I got it back on track. Okay. So one of the crucial things that Dirac has uncovered in his research is that the birds that like to eat cedar berries, they generally pass those seeds in 7 minutes or less,
Wow.
which means that's 200 yards. 200 yards from the seed source is all you got to defend. I had a light bulb moment the first time I heard that. That means I don't have to go down and saw out every tree in the canyon. I just have to go down and saw out the big females that have all the berries on them and saw down every tree that has berries on them. And the good news is cedar trees are very sexually dimorphic. Okay. It's like 1 in 10 to 1 in 7 females to males. I mean, so the males have their choice, right? I mean, females can be picky, but that's good news for us as land managers because that's less of those trees that we have to get rid of to reduce the seed stores. So I guess what I'm saying is if you like your cedar trees, you can keep your cedar trees, just not the females.
That's a very strategic way to go about it.
I mean, there's a whole strategic plan. I mean, and Dirac says that, we need to have, well, he didn't say this. I'm saying it for him. We need to have a holistic fire management context for biomes. Okay. The grasslands don't stop at the state line between Kansas and Texas. They don't stop at the state line between Kansas and Colorado. The grasslands should be managed as grasslands. Great Plains biome should have a holistic fire management context that's applicable to everybody in that Great Plains biome that we all buy into. That is, we need fire to manage our landscape. We have to use fire to reduce these invasive trees. Okay. So I want to bounce back to this concept of a core. Okay. And the two examples that Dirac likes to use, like I said, are Anderson Creek wildfire and Jip Hills Prescribed Burn Association, and then the Les Canyon Rangeland Alliance, LCRA. I hope that's right. If I'm not, send me some hate mail. So these cores is basically a large area that you've established and you have maintained free from infestation. You've removed the seed source from. So that's a reclamation burn and then a follow-up maintenance burn. And then you can just get, or I guess, a reclamation burn and then a restoration burn. And then finally you get to that maintenance burning phase. So your restoration burn, man, you want that to be as big, hot, and intense as possible. Because you want to get as many of those big mature trees that you're not going to have another chance to get unless you get an Anderson Creek. Like,
Mhm.
I mean, you don't get a second chance if you do it right to go down in there and get those big ones.
Mhm.
If you've got some small ones scattered up on your hills and ridge tops, man, go clip those suckers and throw them down the canyons as ladder fuel to get the big ones to go, and then run a big hot fire down there, and you'll just love it because there'll be a creek down there and all kinds of habitat. So a core area is a core that's been burned out and possibly even mechanically treated to remove all of the seed source. And once you have that core established, you can walk away from the middle of it. And all you have to do is defend the edges. 200 yards. Then it becomes, when you start thinking about the problem like that, when you start thinking about the grasslands biome, okay, man, I'm just quoting Dirac all over the place, but he has some really great analogies about this. He says right now what we're doing is sending ambulances all over the place and trying to do emergency care. And it's not effective. I mean, we're just burning through money. I think Texas and Oklahoma spent $261 million in 2019 and they accomplished nothing. Like, I mean, long term, they didn't really do anything with that money to stop encroachment of woody brush. I had I had no idea how brushy it was driving down through Texas, like how bad it had gotten. Like it's ridiculous how bad it's gotten, like straight south of me down through Texas, all the way down to Kingsville. Forget where all we've been. Well, we went all the way to South Padre. So I mean, from South Padre to South Central Kansas, we drove that whole route. And it's like, I mean, there's just trees everywhere. There shouldn't be trees. This is the Great Plains. This is the grasslands. And when Lewis and Clark came through here 205 years ago or whatever it was, 215 years ago, well, they didn't come through here, but they went up around North Dakota. They're talking about North Dakota, driving riding through the grasslands, and the grass was so tall they could tie it in a knot over their horse's back. Okay, so maybe they had really short ponies, and maybe it was a really good year for grass. But even if you're on, a short pony, 7, 8 foot tall grass is still really impressive. And Lewis and Clark aren't the only ones we hear that from.
Mhm.
Those accounts are repeated anecdotally in almost countless journals from trappers, from early settlers and early explorers. And then what do? We shot all the we ran the indigenous people off. And when the reason the Great Plains were settled last in America is because of the Comanche Indians. Did you know that?
No.
Like all the settlers, the original westward expansion phase, I mean, there was a reason why nobody stopped here, because it was territory of the Comanches, the horse lords of the plains, and they really didn't like whiteys. As long as the whiteys went west over the mountains, they didn't care. And as long as they stayed east in the trees, they didn't care. They were the horse lords of the plains. I mean, there was a big west. I'm getting a lot of this, and I hope I'm remembering it right. This is coming out of Empire Comanche Moon, which is a fantastic book. No, Empire the Summer Moon. Um, Empire of the Summer Moon. Yeah, great book. Wish I could remember the guy the author's name right now, but it escapes me. Anyway, moving on. So I'm in probably what would be the extreme eastern edge, maybe even the northeast corner of the Comanche area. And we couldn't fight him fairly. The cavalry couldn't fight him fairly. The Colt pistol was invented, the Dragoon pistol was invented because the Texas Rangers needed a better weapon to fight the Comanches. Like Blackjack wrote a letter to Colt and said, "We need something that can do this, this, and this, and this." And then Colt sent him a prototype a couple months later. So that's why the revolver was invented. I digress. So the plains were only really settled after we beat the Comanches, or after the Comanches were defeated. And the Comanches had such a strong grip and such a strong understanding of how the plains ecosystem worked and how to navigate this country quickly and effectively. I mean, they deserved to own it. It was theirs. They did a good. I'm not saying they did a good job. I'm not saying that the Comanche necessarily were good indigenous managers. I have no evidence of to support or refute that. And I don't really want to go down any rabbit trails talking about indigenous use of fire. I've seen some evidence to support it, some to refute it. I've seen evidence, there's a natural fire return frequency of 7 to 10 years in a historical context. Can argue about that till the cows come home. I think the moral of the story is wildfire is a fact of life in almost every context in our country. And we need to be much more fire adapted, not just with our homesteads, our buildings, our infrastructure. We need to understand that fire is a natural part of the landscape, and sometimes we just need to let the whole dang forest burn down. because that's death. That's a cycle. It's renewal. It's regeneration. You know, the strong plants will survive, and old, dead, decaying things that are just taking up space, you need renewal. And back to fire as a management tool. Okay. So fire is, I'm in more of the maintenance phase on my property. Yeah, I've got areas that I've got to worry about. I don't have my good core defense real tight. I got areas I got to worry about. Hopefully, I've got a 2-year plan to have my core defense tight, and all I got to worry about is my fence lines after that, and then get my neighbors to go burn. Man, I lost my train of thought again. Terrible about that. Terrible about that this morning.
And I'm not meaning to interrupt you or redirect you or distract you, but I just want to say I do love that that you recognize and voice that change. It's inevitable. Things are always changing, and that really, if things are staying the same, it's because humans have interfered and tried to preserve it in a certain way. But when you study the natural world and you're looking at the natural cycles, how things work without any human interference, it's constantly changing. It's always in some stage of succession or progression. There'll be some kind of change, whether that's natural now or human caused, but it changes and then it starts over again. And we're really the only ones that are like, we want to keep it in one way or the other. And I think that's one of the things I've noticed is when people are talking about how they're managing their property, you either have that view set that nope, we want to stay one way, or you're willing to roll with natural processes and natural cycles and not fight the things that aren't worth fighting.
And I think that's a fundamental shift in mindset. You know, we have to learn to live with nature. You know, we have to change our mindset. We have to get out of this headspace of ownership, right? And get into a headspace of being privileged enough to be the steward of this wonderful, beautiful resource that we have called Earth. Hopefully we can have this big, massive cultural shift towards that. Excuse me.
Yeah. How about here's a question. I totally did distract you from the rabbit trail we were going down, but if you were
I
to
don't even
describe
remember what the rabbit looked like right now.
if you were to describe or try to define sustainability, how would you? Or what does it mean to you?
Sustainability means we're going to stay in the same screwed up state that we're currently in. It's not good enough. I mean, that's what it means to me. And that there's just levels and levels of context to keep unpacking there to kind of explain that in a holistic vision. But I guess that's just how I think about things.
Very interesting. And I'll get you back on track, I promise. Yeah, that's one of the other questions I've been asking people because some people, how people share their wildfire stories, it kind of seems like there's either one camp that says this was the absolute worst thing that could have happened every way, shape, and form to my land, to my business, to my family, everything. And then there's another division that says this was absolutely the best thing that ever happened. And now I'm changing my practices and doing X, X, and X because of this. And so, like you're talking about, kind of like those core areas on your ranch. There was another rancher that I toured his ranch. It was north of Billings, Montana, kind of in between Billings and Roundup. And that's exactly what happened to him. He had an early spring fire on his place. They had been getting out of the cattle business. The timber that was on their property was caused. The cattle were consuming the needles, which caused huge abortion rates in his herd.
Pine needle
And
abortions. We've heard about that before on episode 1 with Haas Maguire.
yes, and so after their fire wiped out their timber, he said it was the best thing that ever happened. All of a sudden, they had a winter range, which they hadn't before. The trees were gone. They lost that abortion percentage because the trees were gone and not causing that problem anymore. and it was a huge mindset shift of all of a sudden they began aggressive mechanical treatments on their property. They started creating both fire breaks and kind of what their one of their tactics for, because they also incorporated prescribed burning in addition to mechanical treatment, was they would take, say, the trees, the juniper, the brush, everything from those fire breaks they were creating, and they'd bring it to a timbered area on the ranch and create this big pile with the whole intent that when they did prescribe burning through that area, that when that pile caught on fire, it would cause that ladder fuel effect, and it would wipe out and punch out holes in the timber that they might have not gotten otherwise by just trying to do prescribed burning through the understory. They achieved that huge, punching a hole that they wanted to get. And so I think
When you
it's
can
a
punch a hole and crown out a canyon, it's oh, it's terrifying to see when it's a wildfire context, but when it's in the right situation, it's a beautiful, beautiful thing to just sit back and watch.
Mhm. Yes. So
So,
more lessons learned. Did you have more? Totally distracting you, I know. Sorry.
okay. Oh, we're still on the lessons learned question. Wow, we still have a bunch more to cover.
Or we can totally divert and we can go into prescribed burning, because that's another topic that is near and dear to me. I loved
What
prescribed burning and have traveled the United States getting to do burns all over the US, and it's amazing to see.
we may have to come back for that for another episode on another day. But so lessons learned. Well, you can accomplish some wonderful things with the right fire conditions. The lesson that we learned was Mother Nature handed us an opportunity on a silver platter. She did things for us with that fire that Dad had dreamed about doing for 30 years with matches and drip torches. I mean, areas of the ranch were clean that had never been possible or feasible to get fire in, that he'd been trying for years. I didn't have any cattle. I didn't own cows at that time. I didn't have any stock. I didn't have any custom cattle on the ranch. So I didn't have that to worry about, thankfully. Um, the lessons most valuable to learn were watching the grass come back and watching a much stronger grasses come back, like higher succession grasses. Okay. And I think a lot of other people in the area would repeat this, that they've seen more Indian grass and more big blue stem since the wildfire. And this year, I've started seeing a lot of switchgrass on my place where I've been doing ultra high density grazing, but not so much where I haven't. So that's probably another podcast, maybe in itself. So, what I want to talk about is grass recovery, okay, and forage production. And we're talking about it in both the context of a wildfire and of a prescribed fire. Okay. So when you time your prescribed fires, there's one school of thought that says you burn late in the dormant season. You burn really late in the dormant season because your heavy fuel moisture is going to be low. Your fine fuel moisture is going to be low, and you're not going to burn up your grass. I put burn up your grass in quotation marks, right? Because I think we kind of all agree that perennial grasslands that are fire resistant, that have evolved with fire, are not necessarily damaged by fire at any time of the year. It doesn't matter what time of the year you burn your grass. If it's a native range, okay, asterisks here in the Red Hills. I don't think it matters when I burn my grass, as long as I manage it appropriately afterwards, give it the appropriate amount of recovery following that energy input before I reintroduce animals back to it to impact it. Because if you don't control the movement of the animals, they prefer those burn spots. And they will continue to select them and select them and select them and overgraze them and not use other parts of the pasture. So that can be a tool, patch burning. That's probably another podcast, but another podcast episode. But patch burning is the thing that fire managers can use. You know, you can burn a patch over here on this part of the ranch, on large acreages, patch burning is used. But the issue I have with patch burning is once you commit to patch burning, you're married to it. Like you're married to it until you quit it. I mean, you don't just get to take a year off because you feel like it. I mean, you got to do it every year and you got to keep doing it every year until you make the decision and switch to a system that gets away from that every year. So fire is largely, like I said, fire is used basically in three contexts for me. You have your reclamation fire, and that's getting your land back from the big heavy infestation. You have your restoration fire. That's your holding the line. That's your holding the ground. And you may have to do more than one of those. And that's getting the little saplings and keeping and cleaning stuff up and chipping away at those edges of those steep canyons that you can't get into without, an extreme fire event, or they're difficult to get into mechanically. Keep chipping away at it till it gets to the point where all you need is a chainsaw and you can go down in there and do hand-to-hand combat with the cedar trees. So, we talk about broader context, okay? Like a coordinated strategic biome preservation plan for the Great Plains needs to look something like we need to leverage the wildfire events, and fire needs to be the primary tool. And we need to establish core areas, establish a front line that we can defend. And once we have an area that we can defend and hold, then we can go back on the offensive. And what's the offensive look like? Well, it's more fire because that's the most effective, cost effective tool on a per acre basis to manage land. It just has to be done appropriately. You know, there are burn contractors that just charge absolutely absurd amounts of money to go do burns per acre. That's great. I'm glad there's an industry for them. I try to keep my cost as low as possible because I'm paying out of pocket, right? I have to pay for all the cost of burning out of pocket. I have to pay for the deferred grazing out of pocket. I mean, that may not come out of pocket, but that's definitely an lost income. So it's an opportunity cost to my business for deferred grazing. So that goes under a cost of burning of what grazing I lose because I need to build up a forage stockpile to carry a fire because ladder fuels are a thing, right? Then there's the time involved, there's the investment in the equipment, and there's the maintenance in the equipment, there's the fuel for the drip torches, there's, all the thousand little details on the day of the burn. Then there's the planning, there's the preparation, there's the going out and the mowing, there's the, you know, there's the work to go prepare the road, get the roads in good shape so people can travel fast, make sure the fire lines are well prepared and people can get around them. Get your maps prepared where everybody has a map. Things are clearly marked. Fire lines are marked. Things are marked with, like I will have some things with I will go A to B for things, and then other things I will go 1 to 10. So if I call out, hey, West team, how close are you to point alpha? Everybody knows what I'm talking about. I don't have to say, hey Bob, are you and Ethel over there by that one old big cottonwood tree that's got that weird broken branch on it that maybe has a dead cow under it? Like, no, are you at Point Alpha or not? Little things like that. Man, I keep getting off track. So I'm really talking about, I'm trying to stay on track here about, grass recovery, forage production, and kind of this, overall strategic biome preservation plan. Got to start with fire, got to establish some cores, make a defense, hold a line. Yeah, there's, all my buddies that run mulchers in the world, you're not going out of business. Trust me. There's going to be plenty of work for you guys to do. I'm trying to build that market. So there's going to be plenty of mechanical work that still needs to be done, but we need to get to the point where we're spending the bulk of our money where it's doing the most good, which is on fire. Instead of trying to spend money running around in ambulances on emergency care with bulldozers. Because that emergency care is 10 times as costly per acre as the fire is.
That is an awesome point, and I'm glad you're sharing this perspective. And so this leads me though to another question, because like I said, I'd worked in fire management, and now I get to work in the outreach education kind of side of things. I can't imagine that everybody agrees with you. And I guess, what are your thoughts on how to communicate and reach those audiences that maybe not, you know, maybe they see fire and to them, you are never going to convince them that it's a good thing. Or two, they see prescribed fire and they're wondering, why are you burning their beautiful Kansas prairie? Or three, um, any other outlying factor, I guess. What are your thoughts?
I don't mind being unpopular at the coffee shop and the co-op. I'm not afraid to do that. I'm not afraid to have an unpopular opinion and speak loudly about that. Fire is a natural part of the environment, and like I was kind of getting into earlier, everybody, every passenger on Starship Earth, unless you live in the desert surrounded by sand, or Antarctica, whatever, come argue with me. You are most likely living in an area that is threatened by wildfire. You better learn about it. You better learn how to deal with it and learn how to cope with it. I mean, California's had multiple wake up calls over the last several years. How they cope with it? We'll shut off the power grid so these power lines don't slap each other and make sparks and start fires. That'll help. Let's put everybody in the dark when it's windy as crap outside. you know, a lot of people think that that's what started the Starbucks fire in 2017 was power lines slapping together. 2018, there was a fire south of here called the Ray Fire in Oklahoma down. I think it started in Dewey County down my buddy Jimmy Emmons' place. And I remember watching that one. I spent like 2 days just sitting here watching live helicopter feeds of these guys flying around this fire. And it was juniper infestation hell. It was ugly, but it sure made for some pretty footage. And I don't want to make light of that because, I know there were people that lost their lives and plenty of livestock loss and that and Starbucks. So, yeah, there's serious events. But if we take proactive action, and be fire aware, I think Fire Awareness Week was last week. It's like third week February now, I think. Wildfire Awareness Week, at least in Kansas, it is. We got to start taking these things seriously, and we got to learn how to live in an environment that requires fire to function. And getting back to that, so we talked about a reclamation fire. We talked about the restoration fire. So where we're at now is a maintenance fire phase. Okay. And the maintenance fire phase, all I'm using, like my tree problem to a large extent is under control. Okay. We're managing that with chainsaws and sawzalls, and we'll eventually need another fire just, to clean up the outliers in 5 years, maybe a little bit less. It might be 5 years before I'm ready for it. Then again, we might do it next year because there's a big group of us that are talking about burning almost 19,000 acres together. So, and that's the thing. You have to work with your neighbors and shuffle your plans around. But anyway, back to the point, which is forage production. Okay. So in Kansas, when people think about burning, mostly they think about burning in the context of burning in the Flint Hills, which is an ecoregion that burns approximately 1 to 2 million acres a year of grassland. And not to take anything away from them, but they do it so often and so much. Like they just drive down the county road and throw matches out the window and then go to the coffee shop and drink coffee. Like, they don't really have to do as much active management and planning and preparation as a lot of us out here in the Red Hills have to do. And that's cool. If you want to argue, come to my social media, fight me on Twitter. Don't care. They burn in the Flint Hills. Like their burning season is starting probably now. Um, I would say if I was in the Flint Hills, I would consider burning season open as soon as the first day that it's dry enough to carry a fire after the rain that's coming this weekend, if that makes sense. So like, don't know when I'm going to release this episode. We're coming up on 90 minutes, so this might even be a special. I'm going to keep going. I mean, I said I'd give you 2 hours, and I'm going to give you your full 2 hours, ma'am. I mean, not saying it hasn't been great. So the guys in the Flint Hills, they primarily burn for forage production reasons. And the timing of that is they want to catch like right at the end of the dormant season. They want to catch the last moisture of the dormant season before the grass wakes up. And what they're doing is they're just burning off all the stuff they didn't use last year and letting the new growth come up, because that new growth that comes up, it keeps the animals on a higher plane of nutrition. Okay. The grass is more nutrient dense. It has more protein. It has more sugars, and it has more carbohydrates to offer the animals. Okay. And a lot of times you'll start to see this in a regime with constant fire that doesn't change their management program. And they're seeing this in the Flint Hills. A lot of guys that are paying attention are starting to see this in the Flint Hills anyway, is that this burning every year between the 15th of March and the 15th of April, and then turning out on the 1st of May for 90 days, and then shipping them out and doing nothing the rest of the year, it's starting to really wreak havoc on the plant communities and their pastures. So the spring burning, it's shifting the timing that they traditionally burn in the Flint Hills is shifting their grass production away from tall warm season grasses towards the shorter cool season grasses. And the spring burning is also encouraging the infestation of a plant called Sericea lespedeza, which is horrible, especially if you want to burn in the spring. If you burn in the spring, it makes it mad. It spreads more. It makes the seeds more viable. Okay. The good news is goats eat it. Goats love it. Like goats just tear that stuff down to shreds. So they're burning a lot in the spring. They're getting a lot of Sericea. Their pastures, I always got to think, you hear about the tall grass beauty of the Flint Hills. And I don't know, every time I've driven through there, I don't see anything higher than ankles. I mean, if I can see my cow's feet in the pasture, I've done something wrong, right? You know, if you could go out there and you see see the cow's knees, you might not, you don't have a lot of grass. If you go out there, you can see what they're standing on. You see the bottom of their feet, the backs of their feet. Buddy, you need to go find that critter some more groceries. But what I'm saying is, that continued management scheme of year in, year out, burn early, double stock, it doesn't do the ecosystem any favors. The ecosystem needs change, and that's a static system. It's becoming a static system. So fire, I guess, is not necessarily practiced appropriately everywhere that it's practiced widely. So there's a big forage production benefit that's been known for a long time. I mean, even out here in the Red Hills, we can get some really good gains on yearlings if we burn, if we burn and catch the range just right. It's a little bit harder to do out here, but kind of figuring that out. So Forage production was the thinking, okay? And that drove the timing. But there's a big shift in that because of a lot of us have started looking at summer burns, and that's due to research coming out of Oklahoma State University. Dr. John Ware, homeboy. When I grow up, I want to be like Dr. John Ware. I love that guy. Um, he's the one that's really started to push summer burning a lot, and or I should say, growing season burning. So we're not talking about burning in May or June. Well, maybe June, later June, but we're definitely talking about burning in July and into August, and even down a little bit into September. But toward the end of September, you want to kind of taper off your burning. Okay. And I'm not saying that's a hard no. Okay. But the timing of burning spring versus summer is very complicated. You know, it's a very complicated management decision. There's so many variables that go into it. It'd take another podcast to unpack. But basically, we've learned that you can't hurt the native prairie by burning it. You can only hurt it by grazing it improperly. Okay. So a lot of these woody, invasive herbaceous species that we have, like I mentioned, Sericea lespedesia, eastern red cedar, whatever elm tree you like, all these trees that we brought in, like catalpas, all this crap we've brought in and let run loose and rampant in our ecosystems. A lot of it is very, very vulnerable during the growing season. Like, you can get the same grass production benefits burning in the middle of July as you will the beginning of April. And the bonus is you will kill a lot more trees. Now, I'm not saying everybody needs to start burning in June, July, and August. That's not what I'm saying. But I have looked at the calendar. I've analyzed the weather patterns during dormant season burning, late spring, late winter, early spring burning. In the 40 to 45 odd day burning window, we're lucky if we get 10 good burn days.
Wow.
Lucky. Okay. In the 90-day window, June, July, August, historically, there's an average of 55 to 60 days with acceptable weather to burn on. As a burn manager, I like those odds of being able to plan a burn. I like those odds a lot more of being able to plan a burn. Summer burns are challenging. They have their different logistical challenges. We mentioned the 80-20 curve earlier. You want to try to stay on the right side of that 80-20 curve. Humidity not less than 20% if your temperature's above 80. If your humidity is below 20 and your temperature's above 80, keep your matches in your pocket that day, buddy, because things will get wild and out of hand in a hurry. I don't care how good of a manager you are, how good of a prepper, how well you can prepare a fire line. If you're over 80 and under 20, you're going to have spot fires. I promise you.
And I love, this is the other thing I love about doing this is it's kind of sharing stories, cross collaboration, boundaries, everything. Like I'm thinking back even to my years in fire, and that was, those are our trigger points. Like we're not even talking about like prescribed burning, we're talking about wildland fire season. Like depending on which part of say the northern Rockies you were fighting fire in, we followed that as well. You're 80-20. You got, if it's 80 degrees, start paying attention a lot more closely. If it's dropping below 20% humidity, you better be monitoring things pretty closely. And then we always add the factor in of wind as well. And it was a 20 miles per hour, more or less, that was your other trigger point. And like, I don't know, for anyone that's maybe listening, like to hear like what that correlates to and like what that means to fire managers and folks that are working on the landscape with fire. I think it was, what was the year 2007, on the Rocky Mountain front up here in Montana. We had a big fire called the Skyland Fire. It started out maybe 500 acres in timber, kind of in that East Glacier type area of the world. And that was my job. That year was my rookie year on a hotshot crew. And my job was, I was the weather girl. I would go monitor the weather every hour or every half hour, depending on conditions. And so we'd been on this fire for a few days, and you usually start monitoring that weather with sling cyclometer and your little weather gauge at 8 o'clock in the morning, and you'd record those numbers throughout the day. You'd watch the trends, you'd monitor them, write them down, turn them in division at the end of shift. Well,
I was
Skyland
just
fire,
looking for my Kestrel.
yes, Kestrel.
I was just looking for my Kestrel. It was here on my desk. I see it now over there on the shelf. But
Yes, the Kestrels are awesome. And but yeah, that was the thing, is we'd been on this fire for about 7 days, and you're used to what the temperature and humidity was at 8 o'clock in the morning. All of a sudden, one morning, I am doing my measurements, and the relative humidity, we're down at already 13%. And other days at 8 o'clock in the morning, we were more in that 27, 30%. And you're looking at the temperature, and the temperature is a little bit warmer too. Maybe at 8 o'clock in the morning, we had been around 60 something. All of a sudden, now we're already getting up to like high 70s, low 80s. What's the
it's gonna
first
be a
thing that
bad
happens when
day.
I read those numbers over the radio? Boss says, "Do it again." All right, do it again. Got the same numbers. It's like, use a different sling psychrometer. Get the Kestrel. Like, do it again.
Give
Okay,
me a
do it again.
result that I like.
And we're getting these same numbers, and all of a sudden everything stops. Fire crew, stop digging line, stop. There's a meeting of the minds. You don't hear much. And then all of a sudden, like, okay, everybody needs to pull back off the line. What ends up happening that day? Skyland Fire goes from 500 acres to 5,000. And that first trigger point was, what are we seeing? And that was, those numbers, and that's why they're important. And so I guess I just wanted to share that in case anyone's listening, like, what are you talking about? 80/20? Like, what does this mean? Why does anyone care? That's why we care, is because it's that first precursor on the ground that you're seeing things and they're changing quickly.
Yeah, and a lot of, some people like to get hung up on dew point. I don't want to get
Mhm.
hung up on dew point. I want to get hung up, like, give me the raw number, because that means a lot more to me than telling me, well, the dew point is 57 degrees. I don't understand that. My brain doesn't parse that. Maybe yours does. Maybe some other people's do. You tell me the humidity is 57% and is going to be 61% at 8 p.m. Okay. I know what that means. I can understand that as a fire manager.
Mhm. Mhm. Yes.
So
Um,
we're we're still talking about fire in the context of forage production. Okay.
mhm.
And this is something that's really important for me to say. Okay. Now, I mentioned when we started that, I've been trained in holistic management. Big fan of Alan Savory. Only thing I disagree with Alan Savory on is the use of fire. I I agree with him that it's practiced too much, but he does not agree that it's a critical management tool to restore grasslands. He thinks it can all be done with animals. Like, I've seen the math. There's no way we can breed the cattle and the bison required to be able to trample all the cedar trees out of existence. I'm sorry, Mr. Savory. I have immense respect for you. It's not going to happen. We need our fire. So, fire in a holistic management context, as far as applicable to a grazing manager, in my use there, I'm using fire in a sense that I'm leaving too much forage behind. Okay. And that matter builds up over time. And when it reaches a point that it becomes decadent and over lignified, nothing will touch it. And then it starts to oxidize and become, and you'll see this if you understand how to look at grass, and you start looking down into the tall grass at that understory. And if you can see a grayish, blackish kind of color, that's very unhealthy grass. That's grass that has lacked animal impact for too long. You either need to graze the crap out of it at ultra high density, or you need to go light it on fire and reset that grass plant back to a higher productive state. So, does that explain why I use fire? Like, all of my uses of fire. So I'm using fire to replace the lack of stock density on a two for two reasons. Okay, lack of stock density because I can't use all the forage that I can grow effectively, and I don't think as a manager you should try to use all the forage that you grow. You should always leave a little bit on the table, just in case something bad happens. Um, but I'm not. I can't quite get my stocking rate to the point that I want. So we have to replicate some of that herd effect with fire, and there's still some of that restoration and maintenance phase that I have to do with my cedar problem. So there's two management contexts that I use fire, and I think that all of the burning that I'm going to do on my property, I'm doing it all in the summer. I'm not doing any more spring burning. I like summer burning. It's easier. It's easier to manage. I mean, it's not as easier physically for the crew. I mean, it's a lot harder physically for the crew because it's generally hotter. So everybody's on a side by side, everybody's on a four wheeler, and if there's enough people, I have even gone as far as to appoint a water boy. I mean, I say that I didn't give them that title, but that's what they did. They drove around in a side by side with a cooler of water, and that's all they did is bounce from one fire team at the head of one flank to the other one, and then check in with a security brief back and forth. All they did was deliver water all day and make sure everybody stayed hydrated. So, uh, wow. I don't know. Have we left much on the table, Domo?
Well, I can always come up with more and more questions. I mean, I seriously, like, I spend hours like riding around people's ranches talking about stuff with them, and uh, I love hearing all of it, and
Well,
getting
I'd
to
love to I'd love to have you I'd love to have you come down sometime and tour you around and show you some of the other things. After the 2008 fire, there was another fire not far away that happened several months after that 2008 fire. And one of the big wake up calls in 2016 was after Anderson Creek affected the ranch. I kind of wanted to go around and get a preview, like what's 10 year what does this look like in 8 or 10 years if I don't do anything? And I saw those results and I said, nope, nope, my place ain't gonna look like that. And then 6 months later, I took delivery of that Komatsu for 2 years, and I learned how to run an excavator and make trees turn into chips, and had a lot of fun doing it. And some of those places where there was so much of that biomass, that woody biomass, like I was surprised the areas where there were still live trees that I ground up and mulched them and left the mulch. There's not much growing there. The places where there were dead trees, as long as I didn't leave the mulch too deep, some of the best stuff I got now because I fed the soil. I fed the soil with carbon with wood. I fed the soil with carbon with ash and burn up cedar trees. And then going through there with the machine was a disturbance, right? And those, all that wood flying around, hitting the ground, all different shapes and sizes, all that was just massive disturbance. You know, I can't hire a herd of a million mastodons to come through my ranch and blast down these canyons and flatten all this shit. Like, that's not a thing right now. I mean, I wish that was a business I wish that was a contract business model you go hire, like, mammoth demolition or something. We show up with our extinct creatures that we've cloned in a lab and we run them around your ranch and trample shit into the ground. Like, why is that not a thing? Elon Musk wants to go to Mars and he can build starships like that. That project would be pocket change for this guy. Don't even get me started on Bill Gates and how much money that guy wasted on his carbon credits. He paid between $600 and $1,200 a ton for his carbon credits.
I can't wrap my brain around that. That's
Like they're selling on a European market right now for $48, and I think that's vastly undervalued. But then the kicker is they're like offering 16 or 20 a ton for producers to sequester carbon. And I'm thinking, Bill Gates is willing to pay $1,200 a ton. I'm not taking 20. That's what I think about carbon right now. But I might change my mind on that. And you know,
Well,
people want that. Okay, so we're talking about fire, carbon. Okay, so there might be an objection because of carbon cycling. Well, you're burning, you're creating a lot of carbon, you're creating a lot of pollution, you're putting soot in the air. It's all natural. It goes away. It's not like it's a burning stack of tires. It's not like it's smoke out of a power plant that you can't see that contains unseen pollutants that do not disperse naturally in the atmosphere. Like everything that the grass fire puts off, or even, woodland fire, all those products are cycled back into nature, back into the atmosphere, back into the soil, back into other plants. That all cycles. That's not pollution. Okay. It's regeneration. People might say, well, Red Hills Rancher, you want to burn up all the trees and grow grass. Well, the trees sequester carbon. Well, what if I told you that perennial grasslands can sequester far more carbon than any tree that we could possibly grow on it? And the fun part is, soil carbon storage is a permanent solution, right? We're putting it in the soil, we're storing it in the soil. Okay. When you're storing carbon as a tree, that is stored above ground. And that carbon is ultimately susceptible to rot and further cycling, and it returns back to the earth. The only carbon that we can store successfully is in our soil. Like, since we're on a carbon kick, the numbers I quoted earlier about Bill Gates and the price of carbon, it came from an article I posted this morning. It was out on Bloomberg. So if you followed Red Hills Rancher, you probably saw that a couple weeks ago. Uh, um, just the prices he was willing to pay were ridiculous. And the projects they were talking about was, so there was this geothermal power plant in Iceland. Okay. And they wanted to offset their carbon emissions because they're not 100% green or sustainable. Even though they're a geothermal power plant, they have to have a natural gas power plant on site so they can bootstrap, so they can start up. Okay. So they decided they were going to build their own carbon capture plant that was going to suck CO2 out of the atmosphere and inject it down into the rocks where it would eventually turn into a rock, or like inject it at such a high pressure as a liquid into a rock formation that it became rock. Like, I didn't really understand it. It was a 5-paragraph article on Bloomberg, and the numbers were a lot more interesting to me. So whatever this magic technology is that they're using to try to sequester carbon, okay, they say that their costs, they built this plant because it was cheaper for them to build and operate their own carbon sequestration plant than it was for them to buy credits on the European market. Okay. Credits on the European market are quoted at $48. And this company, they claim that their cost to sequester their own carbon was $25 a ton. And they were kind of bragging about that. Like, the paragraph before that was Bill Gates saying, like, quote, the company that he buys his from in bulk, because that's what billionaires do, I guess. You buy carbon credits in bulk because you have a 66,000 square foot private home, and you fly around the world in a jet that uses over 500 gallons of fuel an hour, and you go around the world in your jet to get on television and lecture us about eating fake meat and how we need to reduce our environmental impacts. If Bill Gates wants to pay between $600 and $1,200 a ton for his carbon credits, good for him. That's great. But he needs to stop telling us how we need to manage our lives, how we should eat, and how we should think. I, I'm kind of upset about that, if you can't tell.
well, obviously you got real fired up. So I I was just gonna say, wrapping it way far back into our conversation earlier, your prescribed fire burn association in Kansas, and then you were talking later on about managing land and fire on a kind of a biome type idea across, all of your area. I think I totally think that's doable, and I could see a beautiful, if it isn't already happening, a beautiful partnership between either Kansas Forestry and the Prescribed Burn Association and any other kind of entity. I know kind of the TNC, they usually are on board with a lot of stuff like that as well. And I could totally see it happening and being beautiful. And I know here in Montana, um, I'm involved with our Montana Fire Adapted Communities Learning Network, and we're always sharing ideas across the state because I mean Montana, we're so big and we're so diverse. Like I said, that western side is totally different than our eastern side here, and so challenges on the west side might not always register on this side, and vice versa. And I know one of the things that all of us involved, because I mean we've got an interesting group. It's diverse participants. We've got extension, we've got the state, we've got private land conservation groups, we've got private groups working in kind of more urban interface type areas, some more rural, some more populated, and it's just super diverse. And um, I would love to see personally like something like a prescribed fire burn association here in Montana, or even like I know in Oregon and Idaho, they've got the rangeland fire protection associations that are kind of a little more diverse. And I think something like that, a model here would work great in Montana. And I absolutely name dropped you to the girl that coordinates like tours and stuff because I was like, I think if there's a shot of us getting something like this going in Montana, we should bring in folks from other states who have done it and are involved with it. And
I'm
certainly, I think your
available for consulting.
I totally told them make it happen. But yeah, I mean, and that's the thing, like you were talking about, even going back to the patch burning versus say landscape scale, like get all the little patches together. Because in eastern Montana, the reality is, it's fairly common in the springtime. You're going to see ditches burning, you're going to see fields burning. Private landowners do it. Whether you have your burn permit or not, people do it. Landscape scale, the federal agencies, they do it. But sometimes not everybody does it together really well. And I think if everybody could bring together under one of those associations or even something of the sort, big, beautiful things could happen. And it would be way less daunting to do it with a bunch of partners involved versus everybody going on their own trying to figure it out. So,
I
um,
I agree with everything you said. It's just gonna take time to build that critical mass and to gain the momentum. It's after Anderson Creek, you'd think that they would learn their lesson with about coordination and communication on fire response and would have maybe changed some of their systems before the next bad fire season. But they didn't. I mean, they put in a couple stopgap measures that you kind of see that, okay, well, that's just a band-aid that isn't going to do much. And they said, well, we're going to keep working on it. Well, then, we had Starbuck fire and we got another hard lesson in how to work together with other departments, across state lines with other help. And like I mentioned earlier, they come leaps and bounds since then, with not just training of rural departments, but also with communication between departments and mutual aid response and getting, being able to get high level assets, like not just mutual aid assets, but get the high level command and control assets, with major tanker support and a lot of organization that can come down to relieve the locals. You know, the locals got to, they're the first ones to the fight, obviously, and they're the ones that know it. And and they're going to wear out fast. So getting reinforcements to the scene faster is, obviously a better thing. But getting off track, and I know we are kind of running short on time. What we're talking about is, is is a strategic biome preservation plan, and getting on board. How do we communicate with the stakeholders? How do you get all the stakeholders involved? There's a lot. And there's a lot of NGOs, there's a lot of municipalities, there's a lot of private landowners. all up and down the Great Plains. And it's got to be a coordinated effort, and it's just going to take time to spread the word and build the momentum. And between now and then, we leverage wildfire events, and we build core defense to stop the grasslands from converting to close canopy juniper forests.
Well, awesome. Well, thank you, Brian, so much for taking the time to talk with me and share your stories and be involved with our little project here we're trying to do in Montana. And who knows, someday we'll maybe read your story and your experiences, and then maybe they'll do beautiful things here in Montana and help everyone out.
Great. I've really enjoyed the conversation today. And with that, I just want to say, Domo, it's been an absolute pleasure visiting with you today about fire and management. I know I said I'd give you 2 hours, and we ran all of that, and maybe almost a little more. And I think we're definitely going to have you back soon to talk more about fire and management and when it's appropriate. So if you're not already following the podcast, you can check us out on all major platforms. We're on Apple and Google and Breaker. We're hosted on Anchor FM. That means you can listen to us on Spotify. You can always say, Alexa, listen to Ranching Reboot on Spotify. You can follow us on social media. You can follow me, Red Hills Rancher. I'm on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. And you can also follow me on TikTok. You can follow Ranching Reboot on Facebook for more updates. And with that, that was my first attempt at an outro live, and I'm just going to go ahead and roll with it. So that's the show, guys. Thanks for joining us.